Part of why friction gets a bad rap is it is entirely possible that friction in an onboarding experience can be introduced in ways that don't actually help out the user, like including questions to your new user that help you as a business, but that don't support the user's experience. Hey everybody, welcome to the Forget the Funnel podcast. We're Gia and Claire, founders of Forget the Funnel, a product marketing and growth consultancy that helps SaaS businesses learn from their best customers, map and measure their experiences, and unlock their best levers for growth. If you're looking to help your team make smarter decisions, this show is for you. Hey everyone, today we are trying something a little different. On this new series, we're inviting experts and friends from the world of SaaS to share a best practice that they think is broken. So today, to start this off, we're excited to be joined by Ramli John, who is content director at AppQs. Ramli's going to be sharing his thoughts on eliminating friction in user onboarding. So here he is.
My name is Ramli John. I'm the author of Product-Led Onboarding and currently content director at AppQs. What is a flawed best practice in SaaS? A best practice that's flawed in SaaS is the suggestion that you gotta always remove friction in your user journey. I hear that all the time. Oh, just remove all the friction and your users will be super happy. But as I've seen, sometimes friction is actually good. And that's a best practice that is not always best practice, so to speak. What makes it flawed? If you think about any kind of learning, friction is actually part of the learning journey. For example, people might know that I have a 2-year-old kid. And if I eliminate every friction for my kid, oh my goodness, you're about to slip. Oh, you're trying to climb that. Oh, you're not holding that spoon correctly. He's not going to be able to learn to walk or crawl. Sometimes it's part of the learning journey. And of course, what us as SaaS practitioners, we want to do is eliminate the unnecessary friction. But there are some friction that is actually good. An example is Canva, where they ask you, what are you here to do? Are you here to create a poster, Instagram post? Based on the response, a lot of people, I usually ask people if I'm presenting in front of other folks, is this good or bad? And it's usually 80-20, where 80 people think, oh, just remove this. This is like friction. But what Canva does next is, based on your response, they actually show you templates that is aligned to what your response is. So in that case, a little bit of friction up front can actually personalize the experience. So in that case, it reduces the, so to speak, friction, or like getting users to see the value of the product quicker by adding a little bit of friction up front. Why do you think people get so up in this best practice? I think in general, the word friction is bad. I think when you say remove friction, of course, it sounds like it's a good thing. Of course, they think about, oh, if you look at a car, try to make it as aerodynamic as possible. So you remove friction. And I think because it sounds good and the word friction is bad, people just accept it for what it is. And I think that's something that when you start working, trying to improve the user journey and the onboarding, you realize there are some friction that is helpful, that is actually adds value to the experience. It actually helps user to see the value sooner than later, and actually helps people to purchase the product. What should they be doing instead? I would suggest that they break down their whole journey. And this is something that Claire and Gia suggest as well, where like you map out the whole journey of the customer. Then you and your team, you try to, I use a red, yellow, and green system, where red is something that is unnecessary. This is based on data, based on user interviews, where, oh, I'm getting stuck here. Yellow is something that you can delay after the experience, after they've seen the value of the product. And green is, this is mission critical. These are ones that it seems like friction, but users actually say, I get it. And another example of one where, oh, it looks like friction, but is actually helpful, is with Wave app, where they ask for a logo up front. They're an easy way to create invoices for entrepreneurs. And one of their onboarding steps before was upload your logo. And people are like, man, that's a lot of friction, right? There's a ton of friction there. Of course, there's a ton of friction. But what happens when you upload your logo is they show you an invoice with your brand colors and your logo. And their former head of growth, Vivek, was like, we talked to customers and users, and they were like, this is much better than what I'm using right now. So actually, like based on interviews with users, they realized that it was a moment of delight for users. Of course, they iterated that and they added a way to just grab your email address. If you have a work email, they can get your work website. And based on that, they try to find your logo based on that. But I think that's an example where it seems like a red, which is unnecessary, but it's actually green. And I think the last step to this is, of course, you want to discuss this with a team, what sales team, product, or customer success think is mission critical, or even what's friction might not, your whole company might not agree on it. And I think this is something that any teams can approach, is like more of a, not just database, data, it's qualitative or based on an interview, but also you team based, where you try to analyze the trade-offs with, should we add this friction because it adds to the experience, or it helps us to show the value quicker or sell the product. I think those three steps can be helpful. So map it out, red, yellow, green, vet each step, and the third is discuss it with a team.
Okay, so we love Ramli, and that was great, and we agree. Not a big shocker there. Ramli is super experienced with product onboarding. Literally wrote a book on it. He does a lot of thinking about this topic, and so we really appreciate his input here. And again, big +1 to a lot of what he said. What I think is really interesting and worth digging into is he even made mention of this, like this idea of friction and the idea of it being bad. Why? So let's talk about, Claire, what friction is. Like, what does that mean, adding friction to an onboarding experience? And then why do we automatically assume or inherently believe that friction is a negative in that context?
Right. So we can think about friction, particularly like within the context of user onboarding, as the steps that you might introduce that prevent a new user from like getting to the goods, like getting into the core of the product. And I think part of why friction, you tell me, like part of why friction gets a bad rap is it is entirely possible that friction in an onboarding experience can be introduced in ways that don't actually help out the user, don't help them get to a valuable moment. So a this is why marketers can't have nice things moment is like including questions to your new user that help you as a business, but that don't support the user's experience. So as they're signing up for your product, imagine asking them for a ton of details that don't pertain to what they're about to do. So how did you hear about us? What is your job title? What is your company size? What is your phone number? Big red flag, because if somebody's trying to onboard into your product, that's not an assumption that they want to be chased by sales. And again, it's just product designers who are hearing this, I'm sure, are just cringing because this sounds like such an obvious no. But it's absolutely something that's been done over the years. I'm sure you've experienced it. I know I've experienced it.
I think it's gotten worse over the years too, because like we've gotten into this habit of we've got to learn all the things. Like marketing and sales has to learn all of the things about everybody signing up for the product, and there's just this like, oh, we've got this captive audience right at this spot, we should learn everything that we can. And so yeah, I think friction has this bad rap because it is, you just sort of see a long form in your mind's eye, right? There's also other types of friction that are added too, right? Like sometimes when you're onboarding into a product, you might be asked to upload like a logo or install a script. That's my favorite, installing a script on a website, when like that might be a really hard thing to do. That's a really good example of friction. And I'm not saying I'm in either case, I'm not saying good or bad, just friction in and of itself. So why bad? Why is friction perceived as this like negative thing then?
I think any one of us, either you or me or Ramli or anyone, listening to or watching this episode, can relate to the experience of trying to test out a product and being hit with these asks for information that feel like getting into the product is going to mean more of a chore than it is going to be valuable. A great example of that, I can actually pull from a recent discussion with a CEO we're working with and a head of sales. So I was on a call with these two folks, and the project we're working on is improving their website visitor to demo booked conversion rate. And we sat down with the head of sales because we wanted to understand, of their current demo request form, do we really need all of the asks that we make of people who were potentially going to sign up to book a demo? And, way back whenever this form was originally built, gathering a bunch of information about the potential customer up front was meant to create a better demo experience and enable the sales team to be more tailored. But in this conversation, the head of sales was like, actually, I use this, and this. I use those 3 fields that get pushed into HubSpot. These other 5 fields, I never really look at these. Think about the number of people who are opening that form and being asked to fill out like 8 different fields in addition to their first name and last name and their phone number, all not even to get into a product, just to have someone call them and walk them through the product. Again, it goes back to like friction is interpreted as bad because friction, when improperly inserted into the experience, equals getting into your product or taking whatever action needs to be taken, feels like a chore.
Yeah, it's like I think the pendulum has swung in the complete opposite direction, right? So we went through this world where it was like, okay, we need to ask all these questions. We should find out everything we can. And then the absolute opposite happened. There was a complete pushback. And we're in this world right now where there's been such a pushback against friction that in some cases you get like dumped into I know we're going to get into this a little bit more, but like you get dumped into a product experience with no context whatsoever. You've been asked nothing. They've had the company has your email address and that's it. And they don't know anything about you at all. And that's also bad. And so there's this, like, what we are going to dig into more and what I want to ask more questions about basically is like, in what circumstances it makes sense to add friction, because unnecessary friction, I think, is like, we can all agree that unnecessary friction equals bad. Necessary friction equals good. But in best practices, I mean, I think I heard this a couple of years ago with Slack as the example. And this is maybe 5 years ago, where there was this best practice of there should be no more than, where it should take no more than 4 actions to get to a moment of value. Like, where did this come from?
Who made that choice?
Right. And it's very much in the context of Slack in this case, right? I think like the head of product at the time had discovered that 4 was the magic number for Slack, but that people took that and ran with it, right? Like, okay, it's 4. It should never take more than 4.
This
Reduce
is now
all
law.
friction. This is now law. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. So, okay, that's exactly what I think want to dig into, because I think, again, we agree. Unnecessary friction, bad. Necessary friction, I mean, let's talk about necessary friction.
Walk me through some examples of where this idea of reducing friction actually isn't the best approach. I know Ramli shared like Canva having a what is your use case like overlay as an example to set context, but like what else might you add in?
I think the Canva example is great because Canva's onboarding is actually pretty intense. I don't know when the last time you onboarded into Canva was, but it is something else. Like they ask, I can't even remember how many questions. I want to say like 5, 6, 7, 10 different things before you actually get into the product, because their intention is to really tee you up to once you get inside the product, because it can be kind of overwhelming. And it is kind of one of those products that allow you to do a lot of things. They're trying to cater the experience as much as possible. So I think the Canva example is amazing. I like the Wave example that Ramli gave it too, because it's so simple and straightforward to understand. The reason that Ramli raises this example is because it's a really straightforward way to add friction to help the customer get to value more quickly. So it's about uploading a logo so that customer could visualize what their invoice would look like branded, as opposed to your logo here, standard kind of thing. So it's a very low barrier thing to do. And also there's some ways to preload the logo. And I know a lot of product teams love doing the domain lookup and like preloading a logo without actually having to upload the logo yourself. But I think just that little investment actually is a very valuable experience in that product onboarding experience to help customers feel like a little bit more, or these new customers, a little bit more invested in the outcome and feel like, oh, I made this thing. So I think the Wave example is great too. Another example that comes to mind to me as I was just thinking through this is, and this is especially related to best practices, it's this team that we're working with right now, actually, we haven't done the full like CX review yet, but the research that's coming back is really interesting in that like it's a developer focused product. And the thing that keeps coming back in these conversations that we're having with their customers is this idea that the documentation is amazing. Like the API documentation is amazing. And on its surface, my immediate reaction was, yeah, but that's like saying customer support is good or it's inexpensive or something like that. Like, let's not focus on documentation. But in conversations with Heidi, she's like, no, like genuinely, the documentation is like an actual aha moment for these customers. Now, we have not crafted what the new onboarding is going to look like yet. We're in the weeds of that right now. But it's so interesting because another expert, onboarding expert, would come into this scenario and say, hey, team, you need to remove the documentation and get your developers, because they're a developer customer, into the product immediately because developers don't like onboarding, they're anti-marketing. And like best practices would tell you, get that developer and dump them into the product. But because we've done this research, we learned that actually seeing these very specific parts of the documentation are what convince customers to keep going through the onboarding experience. And so that's a really interesting spot where, again, an onboarding expert following best practices would say, remove it. And we're actually saying the exact opposite. We're saying add it in, highlight it more, double down there. So that was a decent example that came to mind for me.
So what I really like about that example you just shared is you did a great job of really comparing and contrasting what best practices would have one believe, which is like get all of this additional, material, get documentation like out of the way and just let developers get into the product. But learning from customers has actually taught the team that the exact opposite is true, and that the developers getting into the product love that element. Like that's such good advocating for such strong advocating for understanding what the customer cares about before just making the assumptions.
I would love to hear an example of like where have you seen this actually like hurt companies where they've removed friction? Because we're talking about adding it, but what happens when you remove it when you shouldn't?
I want to set the stage using an analogy that I stuck into a conference presentation last week that ended up going over with the audience really well. I was referencing a case study of when you and I helped a company introduce friction into an otherwise like super empty onboarding experience. And I teed it up by asking, like, has anybody in the audience ever built IKEA furniture? And of course, like everybody raises their hands. We've all built something from IKEA. And so I asked the audience to imagine bringing home like a complicated piece of IKEA furniture, right? So not like a nightstand, but like a set of kitchen cabinets or something. And you get home and you take all the pieces out of the box and they're all on the floor and there's no instructions. And you're like, great. Where do I even start with this thing? Removing friction, completely removing friction or removing too much friction can leave your new users feeling like that, feeling like they've gotten into your product. And you as the internal team, you have built that piece of IKEA furniture many times, and you intuitively know how to go in there and start to take the steps required to get value. But this is your new user's first time ever building this piece of IKEA furniture. And so they need instructions on what to do first and second and third and fourth, if they're Slack, or fifth and sixth and seventh. But you can't know what those steps, like what steps they need to be taking unless you know, going back to something you mentioned earlier, what's valuable to them. So we can get into like figuring out what's valuable to them later. But a very tangible example of this that comes to mind for me is trying to use Notion for the first time when it was very new to market. There's such a learning curve involved in Notion because it is so robust. It is so customizable. You can do so many things with it. I remember having at least 2, if not 3 false starts where I used it on a project and I was like, I just feel like I'm using a pretty version of Google Docs. I'm not really getting this. I remember it wasn't until you had seen somebody post like a tutorial on how to create like a global task list in Notion and leverage it for all these cool things. And I could understand how it fit into a business use case we had where I was like, okay, now I get how this thing is supposed to work. And Notion has obviously figured out that their platform is complex and powerful enough that people need that type of context, because when you get into the product now, it's much more like what you mentioned about Canva. There are templates that you can start with. There are use cases they ask if you want to, begin with. Like there's much more of that. We'll call it friction, but really it's just context on how to get to a moment of value. But in the early days, it was really up to you to just kind of figure out the IKEA furniture without any instructions.
Yeah, it's a really good example, especially when you've got a tool like that has so many potential use cases.
Right. The more you're selling a platform versus a teeny point solution, the more true this becomes.
It's like we always say about positioning and messaging, particularly messaging. We say this a lot, right? Like it's hard to read the label from inside the jar, but the same thing happens with product experiences where you're so familiar with the experience and you're so familiar with the use case often, right? The team is that it's hard to, it can be, it can be difficult to remember the context that might be missing for somebody net new that should be added. So it's again, because we're so close to it, it's too easy to forget. All right. So let's dig in then. How do they avoid removing friction because they're being told to remove friction? How do they avoid removing good friction?
So I think the do not pass go step is, and this can be done in a number of different ways, talk about the academia of customer research, but do not pass go is getting clear in whatever way is relevant to your business, getting clear on what within your product actually matters to your best fit customers. And this was actually this was the core of this presentation that I was giving last week. It was what you and your team assume is most important about your product to your customers is not, it can be surprisingly out of sync with what's actually the most important to them. But whether it is through something more lightweight, if you have a large customer base, like running a survey, or if it's something more like running a handful of interviews, validating what's actually most important to your product, to your customers about your product is the foundation, because you have to understand what matters to them when they are getting into that product for the first time. You have to know that. And that is what will enable you to make decisions about when to follow a best practice versus when to ignore a best practice or adapt it for your context.
The point being, don't assume you know better. There's a lot of reasons why your assumptions may be wrong, either because your product has evolved, the market has evolved, your team has evolved. There's many, many reasons why your team might be out of sync with what actually matters to your customers as they try to onboard into your product and what they need to see. What are those critical things? We talk about getting to first value. There's a lot, people use terminology like aha moment or magic moment or happy path. There's a lot of different terms floating around the internet to sort of encapsulate what we're describing here, which is that onboarding experience that leads to your customer experiencing what they need to in order to be convinced that A, I'm going to keep going with this thing. I didn't make a mistake by signing up on the website. And B, getting to that actual moment of value where they're like, yes, this thing is going to actually solve my problem. And so that experience, what would you say? I mean, I want to say pretty well every company that we've ever worked with has needed to optimize that part of their product experience way before sending more traffic to the front end of this thing, right? So a lot of teams will talk about oh, we need to drive more traffic, we need more leads. But do you actually need more leads, or do you actually need to fix and maybe add some meaningful friction to your onboarding experience so that you can take advantage of not only the learning for your team, but also, educating customers, helping your customers feel more invested in that experience and feel like yes, this thing is actually going to solve my problem. But in order to design that experience and optimize that experience, you have to know what actually matters to your customers, and you have to map that to the specific parts of your product that deliver that value, which then ties us back to, like, how do you know that it's working? Which is, you have to actually develop KPIs that tell your team that your customers are not only signing up, they're not only entering a credit card when the time is right, but they're actually making it to a moment of value in your product experience. So we talk about this as like first value, and we talk about activation KPIs being super tied to like the value that your customers say that they get from your solution, mapped to the specific part of that product, of the product experience. And what does that need to look like? Is that like a single use? Is that a double use? So one example that comes to mind for me is a email software that we worked with not too long ago, where sending one email was not enough. Like there was like a test email process, and like just one test email wouldn't have indicated to the team that that customer actually reached first value. All it would do is indicate that they sent a test email. It doesn't actually indicate value. So how many times does that particular, feature need to be used in order to demonstrate that your customer has gotten to that moment of value? And that is where you find your KPI, your like activation, first value, aha moment, magic moment, whatever you call it, KPI. And that's how you know that you've done the job.
An example of implementing that knowledge, once you have figured out what those features are that drive that value, is the difference between, and what this could be a checklist inside of your product, or it could be an email series that you send out during, like shortly after sign up, whatever. But it's the difference between sending education content that is as generic as like, explore our features, which I have absolutely seen, particularly in more complex products, versus, hey, given, what you mentioned in sign up, here are the 3 features that customers like you appreciate the most. Here's how to get to feature number 1. Here's how to get to feature number 2. Here's how to get to feature number 3. Here's a video, I mean, like, this is just before, when we were preparing for this recording, you mentioned, I think it was Loom, you said, and you were like, they had a checklist in app, but it was a good checklist. And what you meant was it did that, like it drove you to value, versus being like, welcome, get set up, like very, very generic. I'm not going to say lazy, because creation of education content is a good thing, but it's just so much more informed and therefore more beneficial to the person getting into the product.
Yeah, it always kind of blows my mind when we work with a team and all the intention is there to do this type of thing, like, revamp their getting started guide or get them to value very quickly. Like everybody's intentions are good, like genuinely good. But wow, it always blows my mind how many teams have just not gotten there yet. I don't know if it's because there's no clear ownership in the company. Like this is that's a bit of a can of worms that I don't know if we want to get into or not, but like sometimes the onboarding experience, there isn't clear ownership. Who owns the onboarding experience? Is it marketing? Is it product? Is it product marketing?
Yeah, it's kind of in this like, this
this weird sort of
anyway,
is it customer success? Yeah, is it sales? Like who owns that experience? I think that might be part of the culprit, but also because there's just this tendency to see revenue, to equate revenue growth with more leads for some reason, versus optimizing the space between, which there's always massive opportunity to do. Again, I'm going to say 10 out of the 10 companies that we work with have room to improve here. And, in the case of like Spartoro's great example, like literally doubled their child to paid conversion rate because of a very small update that was made to their onboarding experience. Doubled the child to paid conversion rate. Like do the math on that. Anybody listening, do the math on what doubling your child to paid conversion rate could be worth to your business. And I'd wager you turn off your ads and go fix your onboarding. So anyways, that's my little soapbox that I will now step off of.
That was a perfect wrap up
Yeah.
of the topic at hand.
That was fun. And see you next time.
And that's it for this episode of the Forget the Funnel podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions about the topics we covered, don't hesitate to contact Gia or myself on LinkedIn. And you can also visit our website at forgetthefunnel.com. This is still a new podcast for us, so ratings, reviews, and subscriptions in your podcast platform of choice make a huge difference. See you next time.